would you open your Bibles, please, to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. And while you're doing that, there was a t-shirt that I saw in Israel. And it showed up as a meme on social media, which is just a little clever saying with some sort of a background on it. And it talks about Israel and the Jewish people. And all it simply said was, here is this Jewish-looking person with a skull cap and a prayer shawl on, and it said, the history of the Jewish people. Someone tried to kill us off, we won, let's eat. All these feasts, they all have a little bit of that going on. This is one of those times. Daniel chapter 7, as we're in Daniel 7, Daniel is now at the beginning of King Belshazzar's reign. And he's the one who saw the handwriting on the wall years later. So Daniel is giving us a vision of what he got at the beginning of the reign of Belshazzar. When Belshazzar's kingdom was going to fall, Daniel knew all about it because God told him why. Didn't tell him when, he just told him of the inevitability of it. Now, Daniel in this vision that we have in chapter 7 sees 4 beasts. One of them is a monster. All of them are pretty monstrous. But in this, he's seeing little tiny Israel being passed back and forth by empires. When we get to chapter 11, Israel is a land bridge, which we'll spend a little time talking about as to why and what. Some of you know, some of you may not. That is between Europe, Africa, and Asia. This little narrow sliver of land that if you're going to go on ground to any of those places, you've got to go through Israel. You have to. And Israel gets trampled upon. In Daniel 11, there are no fewer than 120 different prophecies that have already been fulfilled about Israel in its history. And it's about Israel being trampled upon by empire after empire after empire. That might make you feel a little insecure if you happen to belong to God and you happen to be part of Israel. That would kind of scare you. Israel is not gigantic. Israel is this little tiny piece of ground today. Even nationally, Israel is only about 240 miles north to south, and at its widest point, 60 miles. At its narrowest point, just a short distance, you could sink the whole country in Lake Michigan. It's not very big. And yet in the end, as Daniel finds at the end of this chapter, and as God continues to reaffirm in Daniel, that it will be the center of the world and of the rule of the Messiah when he rules and reigns on this earth for 1,000 years. That's very comforting and very, very good to know. But God has painful information, and he's giving it to Daniel. And we've been spending the last couple of weeks on it. Here's our 3rd week. In his vision, let me read a passage of scripture before we read this, by the way. You have these empires come, empires go, empires trample, empires take away rights, give executions, do terrible things. Oh, these things are phenomenally dangerous empires that are being talked about in Daniel's vision, but God also has a beautiful way of mitigating that. Prior to the invasion of Babylon, actually well over 150 years prior, here comes a guy named Isaiah, and here comes an empire known as Assyria. And Assyrians were among the most brutal of all empires in the world. And yet even so, in the midst of here come the Assyrians, God speaks to Isaiah, and over in Isaiah 40 verse 12 he says, "Who has measured the waters in the hollows of his hand?" Talking about God. "Or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens." That's how big they are to God. "Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket or weighed its mountains on scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has understood the mind of the Lord, or instructed him as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? Or who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding?" Rhetorical questions all. No one. It's impossible. God is everlasting to everlasting, knows every last detail of everything from all time and all time when it wasn't time. And then he says this, surely the nations, every empire, every nation, every movement, every rebellion, everything that's out there from the smallest to the biggest, surely the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are regarded as dust in the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires. Giant trees in Lebanon, like sequoias, the cedars of Lebanon, which is now something of an extinct species, but gigantic trees, like our sequoias here in California. Lebanon's not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him, all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless, as less than nothing. When was the last time you were worried about China? Or Russia? Or Iran? Listen, that's our modern world. Nations can become problems. God says, not a problem to me. I already know where this is going, and I know how it's going to end. I've been there already. That's the Lord. So over in Daniel, Daniel has a very distressing vision in a dream. We're going to repeat what we read before just to catch us up. In the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, verse 1, Daniel had a dream. And visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed, and he wrote down the substance of the dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Now, this is sort of an etching of the vision of Daniel. You see these four monsters there, and the one on the far right is the one we're going to concern ourselves with today. But this is some medieval, etching here that you see of Daniel's vision. But I wanted to show you this picture. I just ran across this last week. I love maps. I don't know if you do or not. Maybe you find them dull. But this was a map of the biblical places, and right in the middle, Mediterranean, right above it, what do you see? The Great Sea. The Great Sea was the ancient term for the Mediterranean Sea. So Daniel's vision is quite specific. The Great Sea, we can say, well, it's the sea of humanity. It's the sea that is troubled by water and where all people kind of are, and coming up out of it are these empires. That works. But there are specific things going on in his vision. And his vision concerns very much what's going on in the Mediterranean world, even though it will eventually envelop the whole world. So the Mediterranean, the Great Sea. This is the Middle East today. Now, in my vision I looked, and there before me, four winds of heaven coming from all around the world, churning up the great sea, and four great beasts, each different from the others, came out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. Now, we've already identified this as Babylon. There's Babylon. The green and the purple both going from the Persian Gulf, wrapping around parts of the Mediterranean Sea in the Eastern Med. There it is. That's Babylon. Its symbol, which was up on the screen a few minutes ago, was that lion that you saw with the great wings. And the wings, as Daniel sees, as he's living in Babylon, the wings are going to be torn off. So it was no surprise to him when that handwriting showed up on the wall, and Belshazzar is terrified by it, and Daniel's brought kind of out of a sleepy night and out of retirement into this horrendous party while the siege is going on outside the walls of Babylon by Darius the Mede. And they have no concerns that Babylon's going to fall, but Daniel already knows that it is. He's been told that. And so years later, when he shows up at that party, because he's dragged in to interpret the handwriting on the wall, as we read in the previous chapter, that, hey, Daniel already knew that Babylon would fall, and it would be replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes were a large empire that had become, for at least us, somewhat of a footnote in history. But the Persian Empire absorbed the Medes, and it was known as the Persian Empire. Look at the extent of that empire. The border on the right, or to the far east that you see there, that's the Indus Valley. That's India. So it went really, really far up into the steppes of Russia and all the way over above the Black Sea in that particular direction. All of Egypt was taken. Persia was huge. That's the second beast, which was like a bear. And it was raised up on one of its sides. He says it was like a bear. I mean, you see the size of the thing. It was gigantic, the Persian Empire. So it was like a bear, and it would, 3 ribs in its mouth, and it moved, that moved between its teeth, and it was told, and get up and eat your fill of flesh. It would conquer so much of the world. But after that, verse 6, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. And the beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. You have a leopard, a very fierce animal, a very stealthy and fast animal, not particularly huge, but definitely falls into the category of king of beasts. It's got all these wings like a bird because it moves so fast, and we know that as the empire of Alexander the Great, which came a long time after the death of Daniel. And it replaced the Persian Empire. As you can see on the map, it's even bigger. But when Alexander died, it broke up into this. And you had 4 of his generals. There were actually a 5th one, but he became inconsequential very quickly. But it broke up into different sections where the large section, the Seleucids, and they were constantly at war with the Ptolemies. You say, what difference does that make? When you get to Daniel 11, it makes all the difference in the world. And when you understand that, Daniel 11 just clicks. You go, wow, I get what's going on here. That was the 3rd beast. But after that, verse 7, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth and crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot what was left. And it was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. So it's a terrible, terrible type of a thing. The 10 horns, I've already described that to you. Here's a griffin here. This is one happens to be from Persepolis, which is in Iran, and it was an extension of Persia. But you'll see sort of a griffin. It's got a man's face, a lion's body. It's got wings like an eagle or a bird. But look at his helmet, as I pointed out last week. This is the one in the British Museum where you actually have 2 of these huge creatures standing there that were gates from Assyria, from Nineveh. So we're going back hundreds of years before that. It was a constant theme that was there in the ancient world around that time. And here's a picture of one of the fronts of them. You can see here's that giant beast, that creature there. Somebody asked me, why does it have 5 legs? Because if you're looking at it from one angle, it's got 4. You look at it from another angle, it's got 4. You look at it from the corner, it's got 5. It's just a matter of perspective. I had to look that one up, though. But then you look on the crown, and look at the crown. It's got 6 horns wrapped around the crown. So what's the deal with the horns? Very mysterious. Not to these guys, because a horn was a symbol of power. This is King Nabonidus. He's on a lion hunt. Once again, look at his crown. He's got a little point on top of his head. That is a horn. It means his power. We talked about this last time. Here's another picture. Let me go back here. I just passed it. This is not Nabonidus. This is a different guy. Sennacherib, I think it is, another king. Looks very much the same. He's on a hunt too. These guys like to go out and show how fierce they were by hunting wild animals. But look on his head. You've got a horn up there. It means he's a king. It means he's got power. He's got the power to gore the world, as it were, like a bull. And then I wanted to show you this. This popped this past week archaeologically. Remember I told you about this? A footnote. I'm taking an arc right here. Forgive me. But remember over in chapter 6, Belshazzar was the co-regent of Babylon, and Babylon fell under his watch. He was known as King Belshazzar, but he was subordinate to another king, one that we saw 2 slides back. The king was named Nabonidus. Okay? Nabonidus, I told you, was off fighting other battles or basking in the sun over in western Saudi Arabia. And the place where he was, I can't remember the name of it, but in that place, this was just discovered right here. And they found out by those markings, this is marked in chalk, but it's an etching on a rock, that is an image of King Nabonidus right where the Bible said he would be during that time. There it is. They just discovered this last week. If you have any doubts about the Bible, just wait. Somebody's going to sink a shovel into the ground and another skeptic's going to get buried. So there it is. So we're going to go back to this guy, and I'm just going to kind of leave that right there because he's big and he's kind of ugly and scary, and it's definitely a pagan thing, but we're not here about paganism, but it tells us what's going on in this particular passage. So you've got this scary monster, and Daniel sees this, and in verse 8 he says, while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one. You've got the horns here. Now he sees 10 horns, but a little horn, an 11th horn, comes up. And this really bothers him for obvious reasons, because 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. A little horn, something of little power, comes up and manages to subdue 3 kings. Horns are kings. Kings' power, different kingdoms. That's what the horns are all about. You guys got all of this. That's why I'm moving so fast. We've talked about it for the last couple of weeks. But each horn represents a kingdom. This guy here, this creature here, apparently there were 6 kingdoms that were somehow combined under one king. There with this huge griffin that you see here in this example. But this one, there's 10 horns, and one little 11th horn comes up and uproots the 3 of the other horns and usurps the power, and it was uprooted before it. And this little horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully or literally blasphemously. You got a horn with eyes. That sounds really weird, surreal, but once again, it's one of those things that even a peasant would look at it and go, this horn is really scary because it can see. It's got wisdom. It's stealthy. It's sneaky. It's something you couldn't trust, and that it's smarter than the rest and is looking for opportunities. That sort of a thing. And we know this little horn, as we talked about before, is definitely a symbol or a typology here of the Antichrist, the one who is to come. You say, well, this is happening in ancient times. Not this monster. Not this monster. This horn has eyes. That means it's wise, sly, scheming, but also spoke boastfully, which means blasphemously. So this one is boasting that it's better than God, bigger than God. You say, how do you know all of this? Today, we get to it. Verse 9, as I looked, Daniel now sees the scene switch. Thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head is white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze, and a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. And thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. This is something that will happen in the future. Something that we see in Revelation 1 that's typified by Jesus. Jesus, you want to know who the Ancient of Days is? If you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. You look at Jesus in Revelation 1, he looks like this, and this is a vision of the Father given to Daniel. You want to know what the Father is like? He's like this, and Jesus is like him. And then it goes on, verse 11. I continued to watch because of the boastful words of the horn that was speaking. This horn captivates Daniel's attention because it troubles him, because this thing is blaspheming against God. He's blaspheming against the God of heaven, and that means he is also blaspheming against God's people. And he is of God's people. Daniel is Jewish. Don't forget that. The people that are in exile in Babylon, they're Jewish. God has promised the children of Abraham an everlasting kingdom. An everlasting kingdom that will last as long as this world lasts, until he creates a new heaven and a new earth, and then it lasts forever. God promised that to the people of Israel. He promised it. And one thing among many wonderful things that God cannot do. Yes, there are things God cannot do. We say he can do anything. No, he can't. He cannot break a promise. He cannot violate his own holiness. And so forth and so on. Once again, a tremendous study if you ever choose to do that. The things that God can't do just affirm his greatness and his omnipotence and the wonder of who he is. And one of the things he cannot do is break a covenant. And he made the covenant. He initiated it. He set it up. He made it in blood and promised Abraham. And it's an everlasting covenant. The Jews have not been replaced by the church. We have been engrafted in. I spent time talking about this last week again. But the Jewish people are his people, whether they reject Christ or receive him as the Messiah. That's the preference, receive him as the Messiah, because there are two categories of people in this world, saved and unsaved. Ethnically, there are two categories of people in this world, Jewish and Gentiles. But Jews are not saved all because they are Jewish. They're saved because they receive Jesus as Savior, or not saved because they reject him, like anyone else. But they are in a very special category with God. And Satan wants them annihilated. And his greatest tool to try and annihilate the Jewish people, the Antichrist. And that's who is beginning to be detailed out here for Daniel, which is why, even though he's just seen this amazing vision of heaven, he is fixated on this little horn, this Antichrist. I kept looking, the rest of verse 11 there, until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into blazing fire. This is the end of the Antichrist. He's thrown into the fires of hell, basically. Verse 12, the other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. Remember, Daniel's writing this from before the fall of Babylon. And he's talking about Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the empires that follow, and then this last world empire that's coming up. Verse 13, in my vision I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. We know this. Last week, spent a lot of time on this. Listen to last week's study for the gist on this one. It was a very important study on why Jesus called himself the Son of Man. If you don't know, this is why, right here. And the details are in last week's study. He was led, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel, all of this looks really, really bad, especially that last monster with the iron teeth and the shredding claws and doing all the horrible things that it's doing, and the 10 horns, and that one little horn that grows up with the eyes and subdues 3 other kings and supplants them and takes over the authority of this cluster of nations, and then does the Jewish people tremendous, violent, vicious harm. Daniel, I'm telling you the end of the story, we win. Let's eat. Well, verse 15, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. That's a very strong statement. He's not just going, my, that's troubling. No, he's losing sleep over this. His stomach is tied up in knots. He's very disturbed, but he's still having this vision. And he says, verse 16, I approached one of those standing there, where and asked him the true meaning of this. So he told me, one of those standing there, remember, here's the Ancient of Days. Here's the Son of Man being ushered in. And he's surrounded, all of them, by thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 of individuals that are in heaven that are surrounding this throne. And he asks somebody who is there. Now, it is speculated that he's actually talking to Gabriel, because Gabriel shows up in the next chapter. So Gabriel is very likely this person, but we don't know that for sure. But it was somebody that he felt would have an answer, and he approaches this individual, and he told me and gave me the interpretation. So Daniel gets the interpretation. We're kind of way ahead on this now. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Understand this. The saints of the Most High. When was this written? It was written hundreds of years before Jesus and before the church. The saints, saint means Holy One. The saints of certain denominations that are out there, that are in heaven, that people are encouraged to pray to, are no holier or less holy, maybe some are, I don't know, than you are. The church is called the saints because we are so saintly. You know us. Church has made some horrible, horrible decisions, done some terrible things, sinful things, even blasphemous things. But Jesus has not abandoned his church. His church, though, if it were manifested at a person today, would probably look horribly deformed and definitely troubled in all kinds of ways. But there are healthy parts. I pray that we are and that we always will be a very healthy part of the church. And I pray that all churches would come back that way. But the saints here in Daniel is not the church. The holy ones are the people of Israel. They are set apart to God by God's great covenant. Have they acted holy? No more so than you. No more so than us. They have done terrible things. They have done foolish things. They have done blasphemous things even. They have done idolatrous things, or what God would call adulterous things. In other words, going out on him. He is their God, and he is our God. He is to the Jewish people like a wife, to the church like a bridegroom. All these different types to help us picture what he's like to us and how he is to us. And Israel kept going out after other gods. And it was like going out on your husband or your wife committing adultery. These people were an adulterous people, but God never abandoned them. To this day, he has not abandoned them. He is their God whether they like him or not. And Jesus is the Messiah whether they receive him or not. He will never break this covenant with them. And he still calls them his saints. You say, well, that's a bit of a contradiction. Let me tell you about a contradiction. When Jesus is praying for his disciples in in John chapter 17, the great prayer that he prays at the end of the Last Supper before they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays for his 12 who are there as if they had never done anything wrong and as if they had done everything right. And they're about to desert him to the last man. Peter said, oh, I'll never deny you. He's within just a few hours, he's going to deny Jesus ever knowing him with a curse at one point. He's going to deny him 3 times. And Jesus knows these guys don't have it right about him. They think he's going to take over with the sword, rule and reign in Israel right then and there, take over the world, and they get to sit at his right hand and his left hand in glory because, boy, he's the king and we're with him. And he's lucky to have us. You know their attitude. It was like that all the time. Jesus prays for them as if they had done nothing wrong whatsoever. Why? Because he sees the end from the beginning. He knows the end results. Sainthood. We are all saints. But the Jewish people, as far as God is concerned, in the scope of all time, still are, even when, like us, they don't act so saintly at times. The Jewish people in this context are the saints. Make sure you understand that. He is not talking a combination of the church and the saints, though he very well could. In this context, he's not. Are we going to be there in heaven with Jews? Everybody who is saved is going to be in heaven together, period. That's it. So don't worry about that part. But here, in this context, the saints are the Jews. Those are the Jews. Verse 18, but the saints of the Most High. Daniel is now hearing about the Jews. The saints of God, the Most High, will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Daniel, you've just heard about these terrible things going on. Don't forget. You're going to receive the kingdom. The Jewish people are going to receive the kingdom. Daniel, this is a horrible, scary dream, but we win. We win. Yes, he repeats, forever and ever. Marvelous. Verse 19. Then, I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast. The other ones, he only knows Babylon. He doesn't know about Medo-Persia. He doesn't know about Alexander the Great especially. I mean, he knows the Medes are out there, the Persians are out there. But Alexander the Great? The Greeks? Are you kidding? They're a blip over on the Mediterranean right now. And then after that, this monstrous thing. But the monstrous thing is the one that does the Jews such tremendous harm. The Holocaust was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. There are no words in English or any other language to describe the horrors of the Holocaust. But there was a remnant of Jews that survived it. And God saw them through it. But what the Antichrist has in mind for the Jews makes the Holocaust look quite small. And that's really scary. Daniel doesn't know about the Holocaust, but he does know about being in exile. He does know about what the Assyrians did to the 10 tribes to the north. And now he's hearing about what this little horn is going to try and pull off with the Jewish people. He's going to try and destroy them. So he's concerned. So I wanted to know, verse 19, the true meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. And the beast crushed and devoured its victims, crushed them, devoured them. This is graphic, horrible stuff. And trampled underfoot whatever was left, just pounded them into the ground with his feet. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and had eyes and a mouth that spoke blasphemously. Verse 21, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them. There it is. He's waging war against the Jewish people in this context. Now, he does wage war against any saved people during the tribulation, those that would not have gone in the rapture of the church. These are people that would have converted afterwards. That he's not talking about those. He's talking about the Jews in this context. And he waged war against the saints, defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. What kingdom? The kingdom of the Antichrist? No. When you read the book of Revelation, especially Revelation 18, the kingdom of the Antichrist is blasted to catastrophe. It's absolutely obliterated towards the end. And this is even apparently before Armageddon even kicks in. It's really bad for the Antichrist in the end. A world leader who will arise during the last 7 years of Earth's history and really come into his own, unfortunately, during the last 3.5 years of those 7 years of Earth's history. He gave me the explanation, verse 23. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. A different sort of kingdom. After them, the 10 horns, verse 24, are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom, very much connected to the 10 toes of the great statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream that supported the golden head, the arms of silver, the chest of belly of bronze, the legs of iron, and finally feet made of iron mixed with terracotta clay, fragile, but he made a special point to say 10 toes. And as we mentioned before, that God uses numbers as a teaching tool that's very common to people. A kindergartner could understand it, that when used in a political sense, 12, like the 12 tribes, 12, like the 12 apostles, and so forth, many times we mention this, are the kingdom or an organization ruled by God. But 10 was an organization not ruled by God, but ruled by men, still under the authority of God, but not like the 12 tribes, not like the 12 apostles, not of the Lord. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones, the little horn. And he will subdue 3 kings, and he will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try and change the set times and the laws. And the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. 3.5 years. Times, 2 years. Time, 1 year. Half a time, half a year. 1,260 days. Now, that's according to a Babylonian calendar. If you do the math with 365 days, it doesn't come out right. Babylonian calendars did 360-day years. You don't believe it? Take a look at a protractor. Take a look at a compass. How many degrees? 360. Based on a Babylonian calendar, it goes back that far. It's just become our tradition. It's even in our math. It works, but it's still a tradition that we picked up from then. Now, let's talk about this guy. The extent of the influence and the power of this little horn, this coming ruler with the eyes that supplants, tears up by the roots, 3 of 10 kings. Who are these 10 kings? We don't know. But we know that what's going on is definitely not of God and probably in opposition to him. And when he comes in, the whole thing begins to smell of brimstone. It's really bad. And when this little king arises, this little horn, this monstrous kingdom, according to what we read right here and what we're about to read, is global. It becomes a globalized kingdom. This is why globalization, which is the talk of many conspiracy theorists, actually has tremendous merit to it. The world is globalizing right now. And even though there are dissenters that we are deeply concerned about, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, people like that they still have the same internet. Babel, the Tower of Babel, was when all people spoke the same language and decided to rebel against God and cast him out as their God because they had gone to the ultimate humanism. There is nothing that we cannot accomplish. We are going, as Nietzsche put it, from man to Superman. And God said, let me show you how well that works. Changed their languages. Didn't kill anyone. He didn't have to. All he did was confuse their languages, and suddenly they can't communicate with each other, and they scatter across the face of the whole earth. And there you have the table of nations back in Genesis and how everybody got to where they got. Anthropology has concluded this is right. It's true. It actually happened that way. They just don't want to admit the God part. But here's the deal. Along comes the internet. And the internet, such as it is, has brought Babel back. Because you can translate any language and you can talk anywhere and everywhere in the world to each other. This is staggering. And we live in that age. Globalization is happening. Globalization is something that the Antichrist, when he arises, will take full advantage of in some way or another. He's going to take full advantage of it, and it will help his rise to power. Daniel was told by this angel, this person there, that this empire will devour the whole earth, that it will be a ferocious conquest, and that it will trample and crush everything and everyone who opposes it. A one-world kingdom? A one-world ruler? It says so. That's what it says. But despite its terrible power, this fourth beast, as prophesied by Daniel, this end times empire, will be plagued with progressive weaknesses, deterioration, and division. The iron and clay in the fourth part of Nebuchadnezzar's image, very fragile. It's going to be able to break. And if you want to read about the deterioration, the falling down, the crumbling, the gradual crumbling of the empire of the Antichrist, you need to do your own homework on this. We don't have time to talk about it, but it happens to be in Revelation chapter 14 through 18. And you can read about it there. Because what begins to happen is God's wrath, the bowls of God's wrath, are being poured out upon the earth. His empire begins to fall. A little bit at a time, a lot at a time. Economies, religions that he has going on at the time. The health of people who take this horrible thing known as the mark of the beast, which we don't have time to really talk about or detail today. More than 600 years later, here comes the Apostle John, an old man who has been consigned by a terrible emperor to work as an old man in a rock quarry on the island of Patmos in exile because he's too much of a hot potato to kill, to execute, that he filled in many of the details of the little horn that Jesus told him as a detail of what happened here in Daniel. Remember, I said this before, if you understand the book of Daniel, if you understand these prophecies of Daniel, even if you know about them, you can and will be able to understand much, if not most, of the book of Revelation. I know people, even pastors, who refuse to teach the book of Revelation because they say it's too confusing. It's not, if you understand the book of Daniel. I want you to turn with me to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. Now, in Revelation chapter 13, you have a description of this little horn. In Revelation 12, I don't want to get you over there because we'll spend way too much time in it because you know how much I love to talk about the book of Revelation. That Satan, who has access to heaven, he has access to heaven. We know this from the book of Job. He's also known as the accuser of the brethren, which means that he can accuse you before God. All Jesus has to do is show his Father his scars and you're off the hook. That's the best part. But this is what he does. Satan means accuser. And yet, in chapter 12, he's thrown out of heaven. He gives so much power and authority to the Antichrist. He tries to destroy, in Revelation chapter 12, rather, did I say 11? Chapter 12. He tries to destroy the Jewish people. He wants to annihilate them. If he can do this, he could prove God to be a liar and show God's covenants aren't worth the blood that was spilled for them. So, he goes after the Jewish people, and they go into hiding in Jordan, by the way, in the country of Jordan, that prides itself on its hospitality to all peoples of the world. So it's a perfect place to go and be hidden. But Revelation 13, listen to this now. Here come the details from Daniel, and there are more to come, but you'll see how this ties in with what we've just been reading and details it out even better. And the dragon, that's Satan, it even tells us it's Satan, stood on the shore of the sea. Wait a minute, we just talked about the great sea and the monsters coming up from the great sea in the book of Daniel. Listen to this. I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads. Now we've got a whole other thing going on there with 10 crowns on the horns. Power, kingdoms. 7 heads, possibly a reference to Rome or a Rome-like empire, structure, but not really Rome itself. Now I want you to notice something. What do we typically call the Antichrist? The beast. Why? Because it's a clever name? Because it's a name of his character? Well, sure, but it comes out of Daniel. He's the 4th beast. That's why the Antichrist is called the beast, because of Daniel's 4th beast. Somebody reading Revelation, especially a Jew, would go, Daniel, I know what he's talking about. I got to go back and read Daniel again. He's talking about the 4th beast. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea, 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 crowns on the horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. Not only of the world, these are in opposition to God. A blasphemous name would say something to the effect of, I am God, worship me, or there is no other God. Don't worship anyone but us. Ah, terrible thing. Verse 2, the beast I saw, the beast, there it is again. Think Daniel, the beast I saw, now listen to this, resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. Where have we seen that? Daniel chapter 7, where we've been. Except you're going in reverse now. You've got the leopard, you've got the bear, you've got the lion. You've got Alexander the Great and the broken up kingdom there. you have the Medo-Persian Empire, and you have the Babylonians, all combined into one. All the most powerful, dangerous, worst features of those creatures are now combining and supporting, as it were, underpinning this other beast. The beast that is this horrible thing. The dragon gave the beast, the fourth beast, his power. Now Satan gives this power, this empire, ruled by this individual, this little horn with the eyes that speaks blasphemy, and he gives that all his power. Satan's power. Now it's more than an empire. It is a spiritual entity as well as a physical empire. That which is ruled by Satan. You say, man, that doesn't sound that probable. Really? Really? There's a tennis shoe company out there that has this 5-pointed star for its little label. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing satanic about that, except some guy comes along and releases his own hip-hop version of those sneakers with the star inverted and Satan or satanic things written on it, and they sell out like that. Guess what the company's doing? Let's sell them. Let's make them and sell them. And this is what they're considering doing. Why? Because it's popular. Who would have done that years and years ago? Nobody. It's crazy. The civilization that we know in this world today is being primed to abandon the things of God, and I don't say work seriously with Satan so much as I say act playfully with him, because it's fun, it's mysterious, and it gives me a sense of power and anarchy. Anton LaVey, who wrote the Satanic Bible, he died, and now he really knows who is Lord. But his daughter was being interviewed on the Phil Donahue show, and she lied, which Satan is the father of lies, but she said, we don't really believe in Satan. Yes, they do. But she did tell a half-truth, and the half-truth was this: what we believe in is pure anarchy. Pure anarchy. Because we believe that anyone should be allowed to do anything they want at any time with no restraint. This is what she said. Where is our world going? Where is our world going? Defund the police from law, which creates a proper sense of order when properly instituted. There have been a lot of cases throughout history that have abused that horribly. But the opposite of law in the Bible is not grace. The opposite of law is lawlessness. And that, with the rejection of Jesus as Messiah, John tells us is the spirit of Antichrist. You can see it at work in the world today, and globally, it's gathering steam. So Satan gives the beast his power and his throne and great authority. In verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound. But the fatal wound had been healed, and the whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Something happens to the Antichrist. There's maybe an assassination attempt. We're not exactly sure what it is, but he loses the use of his right arm and his right eye. Now, the right arm is the clean hand, which you do symbolically in the Bible, which is used over and over again. If it's done with the right hand, it's a righteous work. Righteous. Interesting how we use the English language for that. But the left was always used for unclean purposes. May I be so bold as to say, in the days of no toilet paper, that was the left hand. So you couldn't do anything clean with your left hand. That was the deal. Now the Antichrist can only work with his left hand. One of his eyes is darkened, and we know this, so it may be an assassination attempt. We don't know what it is. All we can do is speculate, but he's near death, and suddenly he rises from the dead, as it were. What's he looking like? A wounded Christ in so many ways. Listen, if you look at all of our fairy tales, and you watch the movies that are so appealing to us, Every one of our fairy tales and fantasy movies and what have you, Disney specializes in this thing, involves in some sort of a damsel or a person in great distress, somebody who comes along that will deliver them in some way or another, a Prince Charming character or something, who ends up laying down his life for the individual before some sort of a terrible monster or a demonic thing or a lion or something else, and he dies in the process to free that person from their bondage to this terrible monster, in the process killing the monster, and then miraculously, somehow, that Prince Charming character comes back to life. J.R.R. Tolkien said that's just God putting into us the appeal of the gospel, that we keep writing stories and myths about such things, but they all inevitably and surprisingly point back to Jesus, so when the gospel comes along, you know it's true. The Antichrist does a cheap imitation of it. He's near death and he comes back, and all the world follows him, just the way Jesus rose from the dead and we followed him. He's usurping the Lord's authority and the whole story of the gospel itself. And then, verse 4, chapter 12. Men worship the dragon because he had been given authority to the beast. Because he had given authority to the beast. Now, the beast is now pointing to Satan. They're worshiping Satan. And they also worship the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? The world is now enamored with this monster that Daniel saw. And the beast, this monster, was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies. Here's the detail on that from Daniel. And to exercise authority for 42 months. And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name. 42 months, by the way, times half a time. Here you go, back to Daniel again. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place. And those who live in heaven slander his name and his dwelling place. Now, I'm not going to detail any of that. We'll get more into that when we get to Daniel chapter 9. And you'll see more of that come into play. Verse 7. He was given power. Given power. He doesn't make it up himself. Satan gives it to him. God allows Satan to give it to him because this is real wrath of God stuff with the capital W. God is simply giving to the world that which it asked for all along. He was given power to make war against the saints and conquer them. The Jews in particular. We cannot excuse out of the discussion now at this point at the end of the world people who would have gotten saved after the rapture and gone into the tribulation. I know that some of you might disagree with me on the timing with that, but we can have a civil discussion about that another time and why I say that, because I think it's extremely important. But in this context, once again, pointing back to the Jews, which were in chapter 12, and remember, there were no chapter breaks in the book of Revelation. Chapter 12 and chapter 13 just flow together. The saints that went into hiding are the Jewish people being chased out of Jerusalem by the Antichrist, and he can't get to them. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. This has happened before. Daniel was in a situation, he was conquered by Babylon. The 10 northern tribes of Israel were conquered by the Assyrians. This is nothing that hasn't happened before. But this is a much more deadly occasion because this Antichrist is like Hitler on steroids. He is bent on the annihilation of the Jewish people, and that is his one great obsession in this world, it appears. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. He is literally influencing under his authority the whole world. There will still be kings. It even says so. There will still be leaders like presidents or whatever. There still will be, but he's going to exercise authority over all of them. Verse 8, all the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, and all names whose have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. All unsaved people during that time are going to worship the Antichrist. To somebody in the book of Revelation, this is no surprise. To Daniel, it might be. This is an elaboration. This is something that we've talked about here a lot. Once again, I'm just going to brush right past it. But concerning Caesar worship. This is an example of Caesar worship. Is this saying this is happening during the time of Rome? No, but it's like what happened in Rome where you have every tribe, people, nation around the empire. This is now a global empire, worshiping all these different gods, all these different idols, all these different philosophies and philosophers, or even worshiping nothing at all as an object of worship like atheist worship. And in the midst of all of that, the Antichrist, which his religion, Mystery Babylon the Great, it is a mystery religion. It's not a mystery to us. It's something that the Romans knew very well, and that, of course, is over in the book of Revelation a little bit further on, is a religion where it's okay to worship anyone, any way you want, anywhere you want, as long as you also worship the Antichrist. This is what Rome did. In order to unite the empire politically, they had to unite it religiously. So they said you can worship anyone you want, any way you want, anywhere you want, but once a year you have to worship Caesar. And Caesar became divine and an idol that which the entire Roman Empire was bound together by worshiping one individual, and that was Caesar. So the Antichrist, in this sense, is like Rome, is like Caesar. His religion is a uniting religion where you can worship anything and anyone you want, except Yahweh, except the Lord your God, except Jesus Christ. A, B, C. Anyone but Christ. And that's also the Antichrist's passion. And it's horrible. Verse 9. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. This sounds like Daniel, doesn't it? Same thing. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. All John is saying to the Jews here is, you've seen this before. The Christians that are stuck in this position, not the ones that went into rapture. This is a whole different group of people. They could read that too and go, yeah, that's us too. We're not Jews, but that's us too. And that's true. And this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. You're going to have to stick this one out. And then I saw another beast, another one. This is different. Coming out of the earth. And he had horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. This is a person that we call the false prophet, the third person of the unholy trinity of Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. That's who this man is. He is the Antichrist's PR man. He had horns like a lamb. Oh, he's just a lamb, but he spoke like the devil himself, like a dragon. Verse 12, he exercised the authority of the first beast on his behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. He performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven in full view of men. He really impresses the world. Whatever that means, it was enough to get the world's attention and say, this isn't special effects. This is real. This is really scary. Or this is wonderful. Look, this man is a true God. Let's worship him. Verse 14. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, Daniel's beast, and the Antichrist, the little horn. He deceived the inhabitants of the earth. They were false miracles that he was doing, but he deceived them with the false miracles. He's not doing real things or special effects, but people don't think they are. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. We'll talk about this in Daniel chapter 9. He was given, verse 15, power to give breath to the image of the beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. Doesn't that sound like Caesar worship, like I was just talking about? The same thing. If you don't burn your pinch of incense to Caesar once a year and say Caesar is Lord, and no Christian could do that, and no Jew would do that, they kill you. Now, the problem was back in those days, they gave the Jews a pass because Caesar realized that the Jews were far too important to him and far too dangerous as far as insurrections go to impose Caesar worship on them, because they only worshiped one God and rejected all the rest. So he said, okay, you don't have to worship Caesar. But when the Christians came along, the Romans didn't know any better. They thought that Christians were just a sect of the Jews, which in fact much of the world thought at that time. And because of that, the Christians also worshipped Jesus as God. And Caesar got word of that, and they said if they can worship two gods, they can worship three. I'm in. And that's what got the Christians killed. That's what started the persecutions, because now they're required to declare Caesar as Lord and burn that pinch of incense to that idol, and they won't do it. That's primarily why most of them were persecuted, if not all of them. Verse 13, verse 14, because of the signs he was given to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up the image and so forth. Verse 15, he was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all those who refuse to worship the image to be killed. He brings it to life somehow. Somehow, it's an illusion. It's special effects, but it's enough to impress the world. And they're saying, man, he's speaking. He's speaking. We have to listen. We've got to listen up to this. At the risk of immediately being declared a heretic by some, there is only one person in this world, and I'm not suggesting this is what the image is, be it far from me, that when that particular image speaks, not only do Christians listen, but sometimes Jews do, and definitely Muslims. The Virgin Mary. Now, that is not a put down of Mary, but it is interesting that it's the only image in the world that when somebody says it speaks, people say, what did they say? The Antichrist is going to have greater pull than that, much greater pull than that. And when this image starts talking, people are going to believe it's literally coming from a divine source of some sort. Verse 16, he forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666, or literally 666. People have been trying to figure out who the Antichrist is for a very long time and put a name to it, but Paul tells us in Thessalonians that that won't happen until he who hinders is taken out of the way, presumably the church, removed by the rapture of the church and the Holy Spirit, who is present in this world in power through only one entity on earth, and that is the church. When the Holy Spirit goes, it means the church is gone and Satan has free reign of the earth. That's what you're looking at here. As far as the mark of the beast goes, what is that mark? People have gone nuts with conspiracy theories over it. Throw them all in the garbage. You don't know what it is, but I can tell you what it isn't. The mark of the beast does not have to be anything technological or medical. All these things happening today with COVID and viruses and microchips, subdermal and otherwise, simply say it can be done. That's all it's saying. And that it's a global move, because now we know that just with vaccines that we have going on today, and I'm not challenging your opinion of them one way or the other. What I am saying is that the way the world is working with COVID, the entire world has been influenced. And at times in all of this, the entire world has been deceived. And that means, well, what it shows us is how easy it will be for the Antichrist to set up this system, which looks like Caesar worship. And ultimately, whether it's some sort of a microchip or not a microchip at all, whether it's a tattoo or nothing at all, ultimately it boils down to this. If you don't worship the beast, the Antichrist, we will kill you. But if you do, we will let you live. If you refuse to worship the beast, the Antichrist, we'll boycott you. If you have something to sell, we won't buy from you. If you want to buy something, we won't sell to you until you swear on some sort of an oath or show us some sort of visible proof or tangible proof that you worship the Antichrist. Otherwise, we'll starve you out. We'll starve you into submission. And when that doesn't work, we'll kill you. That's the way it works in the last 3.5 years of Earth's history. It's gonna be really, really bad. You want to know what it looks like? Look at Caesar worship. Do you see Daniel written all over that chapter? Now do you understand the book of Revelation better? Especially with the definition of the beast. Because in the book of Revelation, It's not just a random word. You've got to go back to Daniel 7 and look at the fourth beast. But with that, and let me conclude. I'm going to read you a couple of things. I know I've gone a little long. But how do you stop on something like this, right? Daniel was told again and again and again, we win. We win. And in Revelation 19, it says this. John saw this vision. I saw heaven standing open. And there before me was a white horse, whose rider was called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. This is Jesus. He sees Jesus now coming as a judge, as one to make war. And his eyes, think about what was there in Daniel 7 and what was there in Revelation 1 that we read last week. His eyes were like blazing fire, and on his head many crowns. And he has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dripped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The armies of heaven were following him. Hey, you're in the Bible. How do you like that? Riding on white horses, dressed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth comes a sharp sword to which to strike down the nations. Judgment. And he will rule them with an iron scepter, absolute power. And he treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. This is true wrath of God stuff at the end of the world when Jesus comes to set things right. And on his robe and his thigh, he has written the name King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And now with all those crowns that you see on the head of these idols and these images and what have you, these are crowns of kings. These are horns of leaders. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So he overrules all these and rules over all these. And I saw, verse 17, an angel standing in the sun who cried in a loud voice to the birds flying in midair, come and gather together for the great supper of the Lord. Oh, you don't want to be a part of that one. Those are buzzards who are going to gather for the dead, the unburied dead, which was considered disgraceful in those days. So that you may eat the flesh of kings, generals, and mighty men, of horses and their riders, the flesh of all peoples, free and slave, small and great. There will be survivors, but this is Armageddon. Then I saw, verse 19 of chapter 19, the beast, there he is again, and the kings of the earth, those he ruled, and their armies gathered together to make war against the rider on the horse and his army. They had been fighting each other at this point. Earlier in the book of Revelation, it makes this abundantly clear that the Antichrist kingdom had deteriorated enough that the kings of the east come in and attack. And they're fighting each other. Jesus returns. They all, to the last, turn on him to destroy him, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they unite to destroy the Lord Jesus Christ. But verse 20, the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who had performed the miraculous signs on his behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. And the two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. They're not even going through the last judgment, getting a new body. They're getting thrown in alive into the fires of hell itself. This is the most horrible fate in the Bible. The rest of them were killed with the sword that came out of the mouth of the rider. In other words, Armageddon, you're dead. Stop. Done. That's the authority of your Lord. That's the authority of your Savior, Jesus Christ. And the rest of them were killed with the sword that came out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, and the birds gorged themselves on the flesh. The end. Battle of Armageddon. And Jesus is back. It sounds terrible. It's the most glorious news of all time. That's what's coming, and you can see what's happening in this world today just because of Daniel and what we read in chapter 13. We're moving that way like a snowball going downhill, gathering speed, strength, and size all the time. Daniel was deeply troubled by this. In the end of the matter, this is the end of the matter, verse 28. I know I'm skipping some verses, bear with me. And back in Daniel 7. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale. But I kept the matter to myself. I didn't tell anyone, in other words, until I wrote it down now. So nobody else knew about it until he put it in writing, as far as we know. He was deeply troubled, because look what the Jews are going to have to go through. The ones who reject the Messiah, anyway. And that wasn't clear to him at that time. But these are his people. And they have to endure these other empires, and then they have to endure this worst empire. But in the end, King of Kings and Lord of Lords sets things right, judges the little horn, destroys and burns him. And then he rules and reigns with his holy people. In this case, for Daniel, the Jewish people. For us, New Testament, all of us together. Forever and ever and ever. Daniel was deeply troubled. Are you? You're either rejoicing or you're going, uh-oh, what if this is real? Right now, you're either rejoicing or intensely worried, or God forbid, you're unconcerned with this far-fetched myth, which it is not, because you can see the signs. It's coming. It's happening right now. A dear friend of mine, and then we'll partake of communion, wrote these words in a song that was a very troubling song, beautifully done. And it was all about what we just talked about. He's now with the Lord, but his lyrics are still with us. When he wrote this, "There sits the king of Babylon on his silver and his gold. He sends his armies like a flood on his enemy of old. There sits the king of Babylon with many crowns upon his head. He's built his house upon the gates of the fires of the dead." And then the chorus was this, someone who was watching all of this, where he sings in a tiny little voice, "Won't someone please carry me away from Babylon? Far away, far away." You don't want to go through this. You don't have to. Receive Jesus now, and you won't have to, because this is coming, and you can't stop it. Not believing in it doesn't make it stop. It is coming. Because my friend went on to write this, "There sits the King of Heaven with fire in his eyes. He's come to take possession of the world for which he died. Here comes the Lord of glory. Upon a horse he rides. And he's come to bind the fallen one who fell upon his pride." Don't be too proud to believe this. This is coming. You can see it. The writing is on the wall. And we're seeing it before the fall. Are you ready? Because ready or not, you've been warned.